Hello. Now we're going to continue the discussion of Van Til's Apologetics by Greg Bahnsen, Chapter 2. At first I was going to pretty much skip this whole chapter because at first blush it seems to be focused on the topic that used to be called theological encyclopedia. And that is, it's kind of a seminary academic topic discussing how the different disciplines of seminary relate to one another, theology or dogmatics, apologetics, and then you have philosophy and evangelism. So, it almost seems like kind of an academic exercise at first, but then it turned out on further reflection that some of these topics should be touched on at least lightly because they do kind of like clarify certain distinctive aspects of the apologetic. And moreover, some of he goes through a few paragraphs of discussing the situation of the early Christians, the apostles, particularly in the first century, in the apologetic task that they were faced with. And I think it's interesting to touch on that because it seems that it seems like the apostles were Van Tilians, in fact. And of course, the burden is on us to show that. But at any rate, the challenge goes out to rival systems of apologetics to deal with this data. And so it's worth at least putting it down on the table. The second reason that it's worth going through this chapter is it addresses some topics in some detail that are good and appropriate to do. Like, for example, the question of fideism. So often Van Tilianism is accused of being a fideistic system, namely just believe. It's telling the unbeliever just to believe. There's no real reason to, but just do it. So Bahnsen goes into a fair amount of information showing that that's an incorrect summary. The other topic is the point of contact that the Christian has with the unbeliever. So in other words, the thought of the opponent is that such a radical divide has been set up between the Christian worldview and the non-Christian worldview that it would seem like there's no point of contact or basis for communication. And so Bahnsen, I think, unpacks that problem very nicely as well. And finally, just the whole question of philosophical terminology. Often Van Til is criticized for using idealistic type of terminology. And the more general question of should a Christian use philosophical terminology that perhaps comes from non-Christian schools of thought in order to explain ideas. However, with that said, I do think the material is somewhat uneven in this chapter, and so I'm going to dig in deeper on some sections and just gloss over real rapidly others to get, to make progress. In particular, one of Van Til's characteristic problems, and it even crops up a little bit in this book, I feel, is a tendency to a lot of intramural debate or conflict within the Dutch Reformed community. It's kind of charming, or I don't think it's a defect on Van Til's part, because he felt himself part of that church, so to speak, and needed to wrestle with. But I think that some of the, like for instance, some of the schools such as Abraham Kuyper's and Dooyeweerd's are more of a niche kind of apologetic approach. Whereas today, I would say the two main contenders against the Van Tilian is either the evidentialist approach, which is still probably dominant, and now the rise of the natural theological approach, kind of a resurgence of Thomism. And so I want to kind of reserve most of my elaborations on those, and we'll glide over the Kuyper and Dooyeweerd material much more quickly. Okay, so let me start reading. The chapter is called The Task of Apologetics. And I know it can be tedious to listen to a long passage being read, but I guess I would advise just think of it as a books on audio where you're just doing nothing but listening to a book being read. And this is less continuous than that. So, but hopefully psychologically that can help with the absorbing this material. Page 27. In ancient Greece, an apologia was the defense offered in a court of law in answer to an accusation. Socrates was accused of atheism and of corrupting the youth of Athens. Eventually, he was sentenced to die. The dialogue by Plato in which we read the courtroom reply that Socrates offered is entitled The Apology, not indicating that Socrates apologized and said he was sorry, but rather that he defended his actions and integrity. Just a quick side note, most philosophers side with Socrates on that dispute. I myself, having studied it, believe that Socrates was guilty of what he was accused of, and it might be interesting to go through the Plato's Apology someday, but I don't want to get sidetracked. The point being that an apology in the Greek sense is the defense. Continuing, Christians in the ancient world knew what it was to have accusations and ridicule directed at them for their religious convictions and practices. The report of Jesus' resurrection was taken as an idle tale, a lie, Matthew 28, and an impossibility, Acts 26. For preaching it, believers were arrested by the Jews, Acts 4:20, and mocked by the Greek philosophers, Acts 17. On the day of Pentecost, the disciples were accused of being drunk, Acts 2. Stephen was accused of opposing previous revelation, Acts 6:11-14. Paul was accused of introducing new gods, Acts 17:18-20. The church was accused of political insurrection, Acts 17. Experts openly contradicted what the Christians taught, Acts 13, and prejudicially vilified their persons, Acts 14. So on the one hand, the Christian message was a stumbling block to Jews and utter foolishness to Greeks, 1 Corinthians 1:23. So there he's highlighted from the inspired history a variety of ways in which the Christian proclamation came under attack by opponents from every angle. And now he'll go on and talk about the other danger, which is kind of a syncretistic, false acceptance of the message. So he says, on the other hand, the early Christians had to guard against the wrong kind of positive acceptance of what they proclaimed. The apostles were confused for gods by advocates of pagan religion, Acts 14, given unwelcome commendation by soothsayers, Acts 16, and had their message absorbed by heretical legalists, Acts 15. 20th century believers can sympathize with their brothers in the ancient world. Our Christian faith continues to see the same variety of attempts to oppose and undermine it. So here in the next section, he's going to summarize how the early Christians dealt with these two dangers, the attacks and then the false appropriation. What kind of response should be made to such accusations and challenges? It is clear from the New Testament record that the believers in the early church were not content to be relativists, subjectivists, or eclectics. In the accounts of opposition that are mentioned above, Christians are not found replying that nobody can know anything for sure, especially about supernatural matters, in which case there is no absolute truth. Religious disagreements are not seen as irresolvable differences of personal upbringing, culture, or perspective. We do not read anything like, "The Bible is true for me, but may not be true for you." Nor can we find any willingness to make common cause with false religiosity, as long as Christianity is accepted as one among many legitimate points of view. Instead, what we find in answer to accusation, ridicule, and alternate religions is apologetics, the defense of the truth of Christian claims. I'll read 3 of the passages that he lists here. So Paul reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and in the marketplace, every day with them that met him, including certain also of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Acts 17:17 and 18. I deem myself happy, King Agrippa, that I am to make my defense, apologia, before you this day. Acts 26:2. And then from the Epistle to the Philippians 1:7 and 16. Both in my bonds and in the defense, apologia, and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers with me of grace. I am set for the defense of the gospel. So, in summary, he summarizes the antithesis. So that we have these two worldviews in conflict. I'll skip a paragraph, and he continues. First century Christians were willing and able to defend that claim. After all, the truth is not clearly taught unless whatever contradicts it or whatever error stands over against it is refuted. Jude exhorted his fellow believers to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered unto the saints. Jude 3. Peter made it a moral imperative to be prepared to give a reasoned answer in defense of the Christian message. Set apart Christ as Lord in your hearts, being ready always to give an answer to every man who asks you a reason concerning the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter 3:15. In light of the preceding passages, this verse is not an isolated encouragement to defend the faith intellectually. It should be seen in the wider context of the total New Testament witness, which emphasizes the vindication of Christian truth claims. So he then continues to bring it up to our situation, how these biblical facts are relevant for us. I skip another part of the paragraph. According to Cornelius Van Til, apologetics aims to defend the Christian faith by answering the variety of challenges leveled against it by unbelievers, thereby vindicating the Christian philosophy of life, worldview, over against all non-Christian philosophies of life, worldviews. There are many ways in which Christian truth claims come under attack. Their meaningfulness is challenged. The possibility of miracles, revelation, and incarnation is questioned. Doubt is cast upon the deity of Christ or the existence of God. The historical or scientific accuracy of the Bible is attacked. Scriptural teaching is rejected for not being logically coherent. Conscious life following physical death, everlasting damnation, and a future resurrection are not readily accepted. The way of salvation is found disgusting or unnecessary. The nature of God and the way of salvation are falsified by heretical schools of thought. Competing religious systems are set over against Christianity. The ethics of Scripture is criticized. The psychological or political adequacy of Christianity is looked down upon. These and many, many other lines of attack are directed against biblical Christianity. It is the job of apologetics to refute them and demonstrate the truth of the Christian proclamation and worldview, to cast down reasonings and every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God. 2 Corinthians 10:5. So in the next part of this section, which I'll just summarize verbally, he reties this into the earlier discussion of worldview and presuppositions. So again, I won't repeat it since I think it's covered adequately in the previous chapter, but just how all of these themes of the attack and the defense tie into the respective presuppositions of each system. And then secondly, just that, the importance of truth as a system. And so that too, I think we covered fairly thoroughly last time. Then he also adds the necessity, kind of the personal aspect of humbleness being necessary when sharing the faith. So in other words, despite the radical nuclear challenge that this approach to witnessing or confronting the unbeliever, which seems to be quite aggressive, that there should never be the sense of like, I'm the answer man, or, there should always be a sense of what I know is through grace and the need to be gentle and gracious. He then touches on Kuyper's view, which was Kuyper also saw the worldview way to model people's thinking and the antithesis between the Christian and non-Christian worldview. And for Kuyper, this implied that there was no point of contact between the Christian and non-Christian. So in other words, so radical are the worldviews antagonistic to each other that there's really no conversation that can take place between them. Bahnsen is going to show that that's not going to be the case. We go into it further in the next section. Okay. After this, he gives a number of excerpts from Van Til's own writings at the end of section 1, where previously he waited till the end of the whole chapter. So next, let's look into some of these passages. Okay, the first reading from Van Til is from his book called, let me see, where are we? Apologetics, and it starts on page 34 in the book. And here the burden is to make a distinction between apologetics versus evidences. And that distinction is that evidences are the things you typically think of with the defense of the faith, such as the evidence for the resurrection, or the evidence that Abraham could have had camels in the ancient Near East, or the evidence that Israel could have been held captive in Egypt, archaeological and so forth. So those are concrete, contingent, historical type of arguments that are brought to bear on the situation of the truth of Christianity. Those are called evidences, and that's distinguished from apologetics proper, which he identifies with theism. In other words, apologetics is the defense of theism, while evidences is the specific defense of Christianity, so to speak, a subset of theism. So he grants that distinction, but then in this section argues that it's a distinction but not a separation. And before I kind of like summarize the details, I'll jump ahead to Greg Bahnsen's footnote number 6, where he discusses Lessing's ditch. Lessing was an Enlightenment German literary figure and philosopher and sort of a polymath writer. And he proposed this problem that he called his ditch, the ditch that he couldn't get past. So the idea of Lessing's ditch is that you're looking out over this field, and there's this, and you're trying to get from one side to the other, and there's this ditch kind of blocking your way. And what the ditch is separating two types of approach to religion, which are more or less the two that I just highlighted. You know, the abstract philosophical grasp of the existence of God, universal morality, you know, things like that that are kind of like rational, versus the details, the history, the historical aspect, the history of Israel leading up to the coming of Christ and incarnation. So as a German thinker, you know, he was plugged into that lineage that led to German idealism later, but very much gripped by the idea that true religion, or intellectually accessible and attractive religion, is something that appeals to the rationality of the mind. And on the other hand, to have Christianity, you have all of this facticity that's kind of subject to empirical verification and the messiness of life and so forth. So the ditch was that these two elements of Christianity are separated by this ditch that Lessing couldn't figure out how to get across that ditch. Like he felt like he needed to either stay on one side of the ditch or on the other, but not both, but yet you need both in order to have Christianity. So in Van Til's discussion of this issue, he shows that apologetics and evidences can be distinguished but not separated. So, for example, let's say you come in your exposition to the work of Christ, which is very much Christianity specific. So here's where the evidences of Scripture and so forth would lead you to discuss the work of Christ. Well, what is the work of Christ? In a nutshell, it was to save man from his sins, right? Well, what is sin? Well, sin is a lack of conformity to the law of God. Well, but what God? Who or what God? And all of a sudden, we're back into the problem of the theistic system. We're no longer dealing with the facticity of Christ's work, but now we have this kind of more abstract thing, the nature of God. And so you can't talk about either one of them without bringing the whole kit and caboodle in with it. The second example he uses is the resurrection, and how if you have evidences of the resurrection, if those aren't integrated into the theology, then it's just another strange fact. Like Bahnsen would often say that, you could imagine even an atheist accepting the resurrection. Like, some funny things happen. Once in a while, maybe only once in human history, somebody rose from the dead or came back from the dead. So in other words, just the fact of the resurrection would be meaningless as far as this all-encompassing worldview. So to establish that the resurrection not only took place, but that it's not just a random event, it needs to be nested into a whole philosophy of history, and or at least to the fact. It has to be a fact nested in history, but in order to nest a fact in history, that implies an entire philosophy of history, and to have a philosophy of history as a whole, that has to be consistent and nested within a philosophy of everything, of the all. So I think in a very compelling way, Van Til shows that though the problem of evidences and the general, more abstract theological proofs of apologetics, even though they can be distinguished, they can never be separated. And I think this partly goes to answer the common criticism that Van Til doesn't believe in evidences. He did believe in evidences and used them all the time, but he was always eager and jealous to nest the presentation of evidences into the Christian worldview as a whole, which includes this more theological system of thought. So to summarize this first reading, I want to read the concluding paragraphs and make a couple of comments. He says, in other words, facts and interpretation of facts cannot be separated. It is impossible even to discuss any particular fact except in relation to some principle of interpretation. The real question about facts is, therefore, what kind of universal can give the best account of the facts? Or rather, the real question is, which universal can state or give meaning to any fact? Are there then several universals that may possibly give meaning or statement of facts? We believe there are not. We hold that there is only one such universal, namely the God of Christianity. Consequently, we hold that without the presupposition of the God of Christianity, we cannot even interpret one fact correctly. Facts without God would be brute facts. They would have no intelligible relation to one another. As such, they could not be known by man. So here again, we have a statement of the project. And here he uses the word universal in a slightly idiosyncratic way because he identifies the universal with God, and by implication, the system of truth that is rooted in God and revealed to us in the Christian religion. So what he's saying here is that that universal, or that system of truth, or that worldview does account for all of the factors of man's experience, including language, ethics, science, and so forth. But then the stronger claim is that only that worldview is capable of doing that. And at this point, that's more of a promise rather than a demonstration. But the question might arise in someone's mind, could there not be another conceptual framework which includes, let's say, an unknown God who somehow projects these meanings into the world and makes it possible for us to predicate, and so forth? Is it possible that there would be more than one rival universal, as he calls it, or system, which could fulfill this demand that's been set forth? And he's going to claim the answer is no, and I think I think we can show that the answer is no, but right now that's more of a promise for the future. It's more of a kind of a bookmark. Now the next two readings I'm going to skip because I feel like they kind of repeat material we've already covered, drills it in a little deeper. There's a few points that might be worth reading if you have the book, but in order to zip ahead and make more progress, I'm going to skip to the selection on page 42 that comes from the Defense of the Faith. Now in this one, Van Til discusses the problem that might arise from the Reformed doctrine of the depravity of man, or the deadness of the natural man to the things of God. And what he does is he projects or hypothesizes a hypothetical Arminian that's sort of in dialogue with him to argue that the doctrine of total depravity or the deadness of man can't be cashed out because it implies that there would not be any basis for communication. So here's what Van Til says. The Arminian holds that on the Reformed conception of man, there is no sense to preaching. There would, the Arminian argues, be no approach to an identity of meanings between the preacher and the man dead in trespasses and sins to whom he preaches. The dead man cannot even count and weigh and measure. There is an absolute severance of all connection between him and the living. Now here I want to point out, Bahnsen puts footnote 18 on that sentence, the dead man cannot even count and weigh and measure. And I think Bahnsen misreads Van Til here. I think that sentence is still meant to be in the voice of the Arminian to drive home the idea that a dead man can't do any of these things. But Bahnsen took this as a statement from Van Til that a dead man cannot count, weigh, and measure. And in his footnote, he unpacks that to say that believers can do these things, but they can't give a philosophical account for doing them. But again, I think he misconstrues what Van Til is doing here. So far what he's done is, in the mouth of a hypothetical Arminian, he's presented an argument against the doctrine of total depravity, or said differently, if the doctrine of total depravity were true, then there wouldn't be any basis for apologetics or even talking, because dead men don't talk. Continuing, for this absolute deadness of the natural man, the Arminian substitutes the notion of degrees of deadness in order thus to establish degrees of contact with the truth. There can be no absolutely evil deed because then the will itself would be destroyed. It is ambiguous or meaningless, says the Arminian, to talk about the natural man as knowing God and yet not truly knowing God. Knowing is knowing. A man either knows or he does not know. He may know less or more, but if he does not truly know, he knows not at all. The Calvinist, he argues, is an absolutist who destroys the light of day. In reply to this, the Calvinist insists that there are no degrees of deadness. The natural man does not know God. But to be thus without knowledge, without living, loving, true knowledge of God, he must be one who knows God in the sense of having the sense of deity, Romans 1. Footnote 19. Bahnsen says, Van Til here indicates that knowing God is not the same thing in every case where God is known. There is a knowledge of God in faith and blessing, which the unbeliever wholly lacks, as well as a knowledge of God in unbelief and curse, which the unbeliever cannot avoid. The latter is truly knowledge, and in terms of it, the unbeliever can gain limited knowledge about the world and arrive at intelligible interpretations of experience. The unbeliever denies this latter kind of knowledge because he does not have the former kind of knowledge. So, what Van Til proposes as the solution to this dilemma given by the Arminian is that the unbeliever is dead in the sense that he does not have an apprehension of God that's characterized by love and trust and joy, but rather kind of like a fearful apprehending of judgment. So the unbeliever knows that there's a God who's going to judge him. So it's kind of like he's dangling. If God is here, the unbeliever is kind of dangling from a thread, with eternal judgment threatened. And Van Til is proposing that that's the sense in which we can say he's dead. He's dead in the sense of having the proper inner, emotional, or psychological, or spiritual way of knowing God. But yet he still knows God as his judge. Whereas after regeneration, that posture flips to where he's now resting on God in joy and love and faith. And so in that case, he's alive to God. So dead versus alive. So the answer to the Arminian is not that man is literally in the grave, but that the spiritual character is characterized as deadness, and complete deadness. However, the punchline here is that because the unbeliever still apprehends God as his judge, that implies a type of knowledge which the apologist can tap into. So in other words, the knowledge of God as his judge includes enough content to shed some light on the unbeliever's worldview and make his life possible, life in the world. And that's where the wedge can be placed. So he continues, hence Warfield was quite right in maintaining that Christianity is objectively defensible. And the natural man has the ability to understand intellectually, though not spiritually, the challenge presented to him. And no challenge is presented to him unless it is shown him that on his principle he would destroy all truth and meaning. Then, if the Holy Spirit enlightens him spiritually, he will be born again unto knowledge and adopt with love the principle he was previously anxious to destroy. So I think that's an interesting, both an exposition of anthropology, but also kind of an interesting way to thread the needle on the deadness of the unbeliever versus the aliveness of the believer, and how that very fact, since God is impressed upon the soul in both cases, but with a dead type of response versus an alive response, or I should say a dead lack of response of love and faith, nevertheless there's a cognitive point of contact there whereby he can be addressed and shown that the partial view of God that he does indeed have is not adequate until it's supplemented by the richness of the Christian worldview. Okay, well, that's the end of section 1 of chapter 2. So now we'll continue to section 2.